Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. This time, we're going to be talking about Anthony Collins,
Anthony Collins, yep.
an English philosopher from the early 18th century.
Late 18th century, that's right. And often unfairly dismissed by historians.
Oh, really?
Yeah, which is a shame because his work is still so relevant, especially for a philosopher.
I'm ready.
So to set the stage,
Okay.
we're talking about a wealthy, free thinker,
Okay.
a deist, and a materialist.
Okay.
Who really championed the power of reason,
Yes.
especially when it came to religion.
Right.
And he was very much against any kind of religious persecution.
Right.
In fact, he was good friends with John Locke.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Another giant of philosophy.
Huge.
Yes, huge. So what were some of the big philosophical debates that Collins was engaged in?
Well, one of the most fascinating ones is whether matter can think.
Okay.
And this stemmed from a question that John Locke himself had posed. Could God give the ability to think to a properly organized material system?
Just like he gave humans minds.
So Locke was suggesting that the mind, maybe it's not some separate immaterial thing. It could arise from the physical stuff, like of the brain.
Exactly. And this is what Collins comes in. He really took up this idea and ran with it.
Okay.
He had this back and forth with Samuel Clarke, who was a prominent philosopher, a friend of Isaac Newton.
Oh, wow. Okay. So we've got some intellectual titans clashing here.
Yeah, big time. So Clarke, he was a defender of dualism,
Right.
that the mind and body are fundamentally different substances.
Yes. Yes.
And he really disagreed with Locke and Collins. He argued that consciousness just couldn't come from matter because consciousness is indivisible.
Okay.
You know, it's this unified whole. He used this thought experiment. Imagine a bunch of separated particles, say 300 of them. Could these scattered particles, if you brought them together somehow, ever form a single conscious being? He thought, absolutely not.
That's an interesting image. So how did Collins respond to this challenge? Well, his response is where things get really interesting.
Okay.
He brought up the idea of what we now call emergent properties.
Okay.
He argued that new properties, they can arise from the specific organization of matter,
Okay.
even if those properties are not present in the individual parts themselves. Like a rose, for example. A rose's scent emerges from the arrangement of its molecules, even though those individual molecules don't smell sweet on their own.
Oh, okay. So Collins is saying that consciousness is like that scent.
Yeah, it's an emergent property arising from the complex organization of the brain.
It's a big claim. How did Clarke handle that?
Well, he tried to categorize properties to rule out the possibility of emergent ones.
Okay.
He said there are three types. Real primary qualities, like size and motion. Secondary qualities, like color or heat. And then fictional properties, which are names for the effects of motions, like magnetism.
So Clarke is trying to put properties into boxes.
Yeah.
So that something like consciousness, which doesn't really fit, it can't exist.
Exactly. But Collins wasn't backing down. He used the example of the human eye
Okay.
to challenge Clarke's system. He said that the ability to see, it's not a property of the individual parts of the eye, but arises from how they're organized. If you damage a small part of the eye, its ability to see is gone,
Right.
even though the individual pieces are still there.
This debate about emergent properties is fascinating. I mean, it's not just about eyes or roses. What if consciousness does arise from the structure of the brain? Then what happens to our sense of self, to our personal identity?
That's a great question. It's something philosophers are still thinking about today.
Right.
Collins, building on Locke's ideas, believed that organization was what matters. It's like a house. You replace a few bricks, still the same house, right? So the matter in our brains changes, but the overall organization, the patterns, the connections, those persist.
Okay.
And that's what allows for this continuous sense of self.
That's very different from the traditional idea of a soul, right?
It is. It suggests our identity isn't tied to an unchanging, immaterial essence, but to the structure of our physical brains.
And our brains are constantly evolving.
Absolutely. And this led to another debate between Clarke and Collins about memory this time.
Okay.
Clarke, who still believed in the soul, argued that memory couldn't be a true representation of the past if the substance of the brain had changed.
Oh, I see.
Because how can you remember something if the thing that experienced it doesn't exist in the same form anymore?
Right. So our memories would be like echoes in a cave.
Yeah, fading, unreliable remnants of a self that is no longer there.
Yeah.
But Collins had a different take.
Yep.
He argued that memories are representations of events, like imprints or patterns, that can be transferred as the brain's matter changes.
Okay.
Like copying a file from one hard drive to another.
Right.
The information stays the same, even though the physical stuff has changed. And he said this constant imprinting of memories as the brain changes, that explains why we forget some things and remember others. The memories we use a lot get imprinted more strongly, others fade.
So he's suggesting memory isn't about holding on to specific bits of matter. It's more about maintaining patterns.
Yeah, within a system that's changing all the time.
That's pretty sophisticated for the early 18th century.
It is. And it shows how Collins was thinking about the connection between mind and matter. His ideas even foreshadow some modern theories about consciousness and personal identity. And it all connects back to his core belief in the power of reason.
This is what I'm really interested in. Collins seems like someone who wasn't afraid to question anything, to apply reason to even the most controversial topics.
You're absolutely right, and that's what we'll talk about next time. We'll explore Collins' views on determinism, free will, and his defense of free thinking, especially when it comes to religion.
It sounds like things are about to get even more interesting.
They are. Buckle up.
All right, so we've talked about how Anthony Collins was a really deep thinker about the mind and matter, pushing the boundaries in his time. But I'm curious about how that led him to determinism and free will.
Right. That's a key part of his philosophy. Since he saw the mind as arising from the material world governed by cause and effect, he figured that our actions must also be determined.
Okay, so every action we take, every choice we make is just the result of a chain of causes.
Yeah, stretching back indefinitely. He believed that.
Okay, I can already hear some philosophers objecting to that.
Yeah.
It almost like it takes away our agency. Our ability to make real choices.
Oh, absolutely. He knew about those counter-arguments.
Okay.
And he addressed them in his work. He understood that the feeling of free will, that we're in control, it's very powerful, even if he believed it was an illusion.
So how did he reconcile this idea that everything is determined with the feeling that we do have control over our lives?
Well, one way was by comparing human action to a clock.
A clock.
Yeah. Both are determined, he argued, just by different causes.
Okay.
A clock is, run by gears and springs.
Right.
Humans were driven by desires and aversions,
Okay.
which are shaped by our experiences
Right.
and our environment.
So we shouldn't blame the clock for ticking.
Yeah.
And we shouldn't blame people for acting according to how they're made, even if how they're made is a result of all these causes.
Exactly. And he really fleshed out these ideas in his 1717 book, A Philosophical Inquiry Concerning Human Liberty,
Okay.
where he lays out 6 arguments in support of determinism.
6 arguments. He was serious about this. Can we go into a couple of those?
Yeah, definitely. One that I find interesting is what he called the experience argument,
Okay.
which says our belief in free will, it comes from our limited perspective, our failure to see all the causes that influence our actions. We feel like we're choosing freely because we're not aware of all the factors.
Internal, external, everything.
Well, all of it.
Okay.
Contributing to those choices.
It's like we're driving a car, but we're so focused on the steering wheel, we don't see the engine, the mechanics, the roads, the traffic lights, all the things that are actually determining where we end up.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. It highlights the limitations of how we look inward, to understand ourselves. He also had the argument from beginnings, which essentially says that everything that has a beginning must have a cause.
Okay.
So all actions, they obviously have beginning,
Right.
therefore they must be caused.
So our will isn't some special thing that can just initiate action without being influenced by something before
Let's
it.
key challenge that.
I'm curious, how did people respond to this? Like his contemporaries, people who disagreed with him?
Well, of course, there was some pushback. Samuel Clarke, who we mentioned before, he was a strong advocate for libertarian free will.
Okay.
The idea that we have real choice and could have acted differently in any situation.
Okay.
He saw free will as this self-moving power, not dependent on any causes.
So a real clash of worldviews.
Yeah, for sure.
This debate, determinism versus free will, it was just as lively back then as it is today.
Oh, absolutely. It's a central question in philosophy. Now, there's also this text called A Dissertation on Liberty and Necessity that came out in 1729, just after Collins died. It's got his initials on it, AC, but some scholars aren't sure if he actually wrote it.
Oh, a philosophical mystery.
Yeah. So the author, whoever it was, they argue that at every stage of thinking, perceiving, judging, willing, acting, we're actually passive.
Hmm.
We're not actively choosing or judging or willing, but being acted upon by external forces and internal drives we can't control.
Our minds aren't the captains of our ships. They're more like passengers being swept along by the currents.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that this dissertation actually addresses a criticism that Clark had of Collins's earlier work. Clark said that perception is passive, not an action, which Collins kind of overlooked in his inquiry. But the dissertation author, they concede that point. They say perception is an operation, not an action. It seems like maybe Collins' thinking was evolving.
So even after his death, the debate continues. And Collins, or someone continuing his ideas, is still engaging with those criticisms. Really interesting.
It is, and it leads us to another important part of Collins' philosophy, his strong belief in free thinking.
Yeah, this is what I find so fascinating about Collins. It's not just his specific arguments, but his commitment to using reason in every area, even the most controversial.
Right, and it's important to remember the context. He lived in a time when religious dogma was very powerful.
Okay.
He saw how blind faith and unquestioning obedience were used to stifle critical thinking
Yeah.
and to justify things like persecution.
So free thinking wasn't just an intellectual exercise for Collins. It was a moral imperative.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was especially important when it came to religion. He was concerned about how religious authorities use their power to enforce conformity. He believed everyone had the right to use their reason to examine religious claims and decide for themselves what they believed.
That's a radical idea, even today.
It is. It challenges the whole concept of religious authority.
It does. It puts the power to interpret in the hands of the individual.
Yeah. And Collins wasn't afraid to push those boundaries. His most famous and controversial work, A Discourse of Freethinking, came out in 1713. It's basically a manifesto for intellectual freedom, especially in religion. He argues that free thinking is not just a right, but necessary for progress.
I bet that caused a stir.
Oh, huge. Lots of controversy, tons of responses. But it solidified Collins' place as a leading voice for intellectual freedom, something that still inspires us.
Okay, I'm ready to dive into that discourse. What are some of his key arguments for free thinking?
Well, he starts with a definition. He says free thinking is the use of the understanding in endeavoring to find out the meaning of any proposition whatsoever, in considering the nature and evidence for or against it, and in judging of it according to the seeming force or weakness of the evidence.
So basically, use your reason to evaluate any claim, no matter how controversial.
Exactly. No topic is off limits.
Yeah.
And then he makes a bunch of arguments in favor of this approach. One that stands out is his analogy between thinking and a craft, like painting or music.
Okay.
He says, just like restricting an artist would stifle their creativity and skill, restricting a thinker keeps them from reaching their potential.
Right, you can't force someone to be a great painter by giving them a bunch of rules.
Yeah, they need to experiment, explore, make mistakes. And Collins applies this to thought. He says, if we really want to understand the world, we need to be willing to question even our most cherished beliefs.
But free thinking can be uncomfortable, right?
Yeah.
Even dangerous. It means challenging what we hold dear and sometimes confronting powerful people or institutions. Did Collins address that?
He did. He knew his ideas would be met with resistance, that some people would see free thinking as a threat. One common objection was that it would lead to chaos and, moral decay.
Yeah, the classic argument against change.
Right. But Collins argued that suppressing thought actually leads to more problems, more dogma, more intolerance, even violence. He thought open inquiry and debate were essential for a healthy society.
He was saying, let's air our differences, talk about them openly.
Yeah, and arrive at a shared understanding. He also used the witchcraft example again. As people started thinking more critically, they saw that accusations of witchcraft were often based on fear and superstition. Free thinking led to more compassion.
So challenging the status quo can actually lead to a better society.
Exactly. But Collins also argued that free thinking was crucial for choosing the right religion, if you wanted a religion. He pointed out that there were so many different Christian sects, all claiming to have the truth.
Right.
So how can you know which one to follow without using your reason to examine the evidence?
It's like you can't just blindly accept what you're told. You have to think for yourself.
Exactly. He believed forcing people to conform without letting them question undermines faith. Real faith has to be chosen freely based on understanding.
That's a very modern way of thinking about religion.
It is. And it's worth noting that Collins lived by these principles. He had a huge library, and he opened it to everyone, even people who disagreed with him. He wanted to encourage debate.
That shows real commitment to his beliefs. He wasn't just talking the talk, he was walking the walk.
He was, and his willingness to engage with critics, even help them challenge his own views, shows real integrity.
So what can we take away from Anthony Collins today?
I think he reminds us that questioning and debating are crucial for intellectual growth, that no idea, no matter how important, should be off limits. And maybe most importantly, he shows us that true conviction comes from wrestling with tough questions, looking at the evidence, and coming to our own conclusions, even if they're unconventional.
It's wild to think that a book from, like, the 1700s could still be so relevant. This discourse of free thinking, did it cause a big reaction back then?
Oh yeah, you can bet. A book challenging the church back then. Forget about it. It was huge. People were writing responses left and right.
So it really hit a nerve. What were people saying? Like, what were the main criticisms of Collins and this whole free thinking thing?
A lot of folks said that if everyone just thought whatever they wanted, it'd lead to chaos. Undermine religion, which was a big deal back then. They thought ordinary people weren't smart enough to figure out these theological questions on their own. They needed the church to guide them.
That was like the same old argument for keeping things the way they are.
Yeah.
Those in power don't want people thinking for themselves, rocking the boat.
Exactly. But Collins had a response for that.
Oh, I bet he did.
He said that trying to suppress thought actually creates more problems down the line.
Okay.
It leads to people being stubborn, not tolerating other viewpoints, and even violence. He thought open discussion and debate were key for a healthy society.
Kind of like, let's bring those controversial ideas out in the open instead of letting them fester in the dark.
Right. He said sunlight's the best way to clean things up, and he brought up witchcraft again. When people started thinking more critically, they realized those accusations were often based on fear and superstition, which led to innocent people getting hurt. Free thinking led to more compassion, better outcomes.
So basically, challenging the status quo can lead to positive change.
Yeah, he believed that. But he didn't stop there. He also said free thinking was important for picking the right religion if you were going to be religious at all. He pointed out there were all these different Christian groups back then, each saying they had the right interpretation of the Bible.
Right, right.
So he asked, how could anyone possibly know which one to follow without using their own reason to look at the evidence?
So you can't just blindly believe what you're told. You got to think for yourself.
Exactly. He said forcing people to conform without letting them question actually weakens faith. True faith has to be chosen freely, he argued.
That's a very modern way of thinking about religion.
It is. And it's important to note that Collins practiced what he preached. He had this huge library open to everyone, even people who completely disagreed with him. He wanted to encourage open discussion.
So he wasn't all talk. He really believed in these ideas.
He did. And his willingness to talk with his critics, even give them resources to argue against him, shows real integrity.
So what can we take away from Anthony Collins today, after all this time?
Well, I think he reminds us that questioning and debating are important for how we grow intellectually, as individuals and as a society. No idea is too sacred to be examined. And maybe most importantly, he shows us that real conviction comes from grappling with tough questions, looking at the evidence, and forming our own conclusions, even if they're different from what everyone else thinks.
What a legacy, a real trailblazer. He helped pave the way for so much progress in science, philosophy, human rights. Thanks for taking us on this deep dive into Anthony Collins.
It was my pleasure. He's a fascinating figure who deserves to be remembered.
And to our listener, we encourage you to explore Collins' work yourself. See what you think of his ideas. You might be surprised how much they resonate even today. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, keep thinking freely.